I watched my father, standing silent by the dinner table, his eyes hollow while my mother collapsed at his feet. She gasped for air on the cold marble floor, and he did nothing. No words, no movement, just watched. That was the moment I knew the man I once called father had killed my mother with his silence. 15 years later, I returned to that mansion, but not as his daughter. I came back as the sentence they couldn't escape. If you think this is just another family drama, you're wrong. Subscribe now to hear the stories they wish you'd never know. I was 15 the day my mother died. People think grief is loud, that it howls and claws and leaves you raw and breathless. But that's not true. Grief is quiet. It's the kind of silence that presses into your ears until you hear nothing but the sound of your own breathing, like the world itself forgot how to make noise. The rain was coming down hard that night, heavy straight sheets of water that hammered the old Evans estate like punishment. I remember standing there barefoot on the front steps, soaked to the skin, clutching nothing but the photograph I grabbed without thinking Mom and me summer of '08. She was laughing in that picture. I wasn't. The door slammed shut behind me. That sound I remember, the finality of it. I turned slow heavy like my body wasn't mine and looked back at the house I used to call home. The lights were still on inside. From the window I could see them, my father and Ivy, standing just inside the grand foyer, their silhouettes framed against the chandelier light. Ivy's arms crossed her hair, pulled tight like always. Dad standing just behind her, his hand resting absently on her shoulder. His favorite. His real daughter. Not me! Neither of them opened the door again. Neither of them called me back. Not after what they said. Not after what I heard. She's not family anymore. Dad's voice cold surgical like he was explaining the weather. And Ivy, my little sister by blood, but never by heart, whispering, "Let her go, Dad. She's just like her." Her, my mother, the woman they'd buried not 2 hours earlier. I didn't know grief could come in layers. But it did. First, my mother's death found collapsed in her study teacup, shattered beside her hand. The coroner said it was a heart attack. Quick, painless. That's what they told me. But I knew my mother. Nothing about her death felt quick or painless or right. Then, barely an hour after lowering her into the earth, came the second death me. Evan's inheritance passes to Ivy, per agreement. Those words. That's when I realized Dad had been planning this. Not days, not weeks, but years. The document, the signatures. Forged, forced, I didn't know. I didn't get to ask. I wasn't allowed in the office. I wasn't allowed anywhere. I remember standing in that front hall, still in my black funeral dress mud on the hem, tears burning behind my eyes. My fingers clenched around the photograph until the edges cut into my skin. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. My voice cracked. I remember that, too. Dad looked at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into his home. "You'll figure it out. No emotion, no guilt." Ivy just smirked. "You always were dramatic, Emma." That's when I ran. Out the door, down the steps, into the storm. But I stopped. Just there, at the end of the drive. I stopped, turned back. Stupid, naive instinct. Some broken part of me still thought he'd follow, still thought someone inside that house cared enough to chase me. No one came. And so I stood there, letting the rain soak me to the bone. My teeth chattered, my skin burned cold, but I didn't move. Because that was the moment I realized something. Grief isn't loud. Betrayal is. It screams inside your skull until your own name feels foreign, until your own reflection feels wrong. I remember the headlights. Somewhere down the long, winding road a car passed. I thought about stepping out in front of it, just for a second. But even that felt like giving them too much. So I stayed. I don't know how long. Long enough for the rain to stop. Long enough for the cold to settle so deep I stopped feeling it. When I finally walked away from that house, I didn't cry. I didn't shiver. I didn't look back again. I told myself I was done being weak. But even then I lied. Because as I walked barefoot, blood mixing with mud dress, clinging to my body photograph crumpled in my fist, I felt one thing. Not hate. Not anger. Not even sorrow. I felt small. I felt like nothing. I was 15 years old, and I'd just learned in the Evans family love was conditional. And I had failed the terms. I remember counting my steps. 1, 2, 3, all the way down the long driveway. The gates stayed open behind me, not to welcome me back, but to spit me out. Somewhere behind those iron gates, Ivy and Dad probably went back to their expensive wine, their inheritance paperwork, their neatly controlled little world. And somewhere beyond that storm, my mother's body lay cold under fresh dirt. I wondered if she felt as abandoned as I did. I didn't know then. But that night wasn't the end of my story. It was the start. The start of something darker. The start of something colder. The start of someone new? Me. Emma Evans died in the rain that night, and someone else began walking in her place. I didn't know what revenge looked like. Not yet, but I knew what betrayal felt like. And that was enough. It had to be. Because when the people who are supposed to love you choose silence over protection, you learn fast the only person who can save you is yourself. I still hear the sound sometimes. Not the rain, not their voices, the sound of the door locking behind me. And I remember thinking, so this is what it feels like to lose everything. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. 15 years later, the rain was gone. In its place, sunlight, glass towers, polished streets, where money moved like blood through veins of concrete and steel. And in the middle of it all, Emma Evans stepped out of the black Bentley with the quiet precision of someone who no longer needed to announce her presence to be noticed. She wore black, not for mourning, for control. Her heels touched the sidewalk with a click that turned heads. Not because people recognized her, because they recognized power. Evans Capital. Her name, not his. The name everyone in this city knew. Banks, brokers, senators didn't matter. If they handled money, they knew Evans Capital. And they knew the woman behind it. The woman who had risen from nowhere. No one ever asked about her past. In this world, success rewrote everything. But success didn't heal. Emma paused beside the tinted car window and adjusted the cuff of her tailored suit. Diamond cufflinks. A gift. From herself. Then she looked up. Above her, the building that bore her name in silver letters stretching 20 stories into the Texas sky. Below her skin, something colder. Her phone vibrated once in her pocket. She didn't check it. She didn't need to. It would be the same as it had been every week for the past year. Another acquisition. Another victory. Another chess piece moved. Another distraction. But not today. Today wasn't about business. Today wasn't about money. Today was about ending something. The driver opened the door behind her. Ms. Evans. Emma didn't turn. Her eyes stayed fixed on the glass skyline. Keep the engine running. He hesitated. She could feel it, the confusion. No one told Emma Evans where to go or when, but she gave no explanation. She never did. She walked. The world behind her, the empire she built, faded. What lay ahead, however, was something else entirely. A memory. A scar. A house. Emma crossed the street, weaving between pedestrians who didn't know her, didn't care. And that anonymity, once a shield, felt like an ache beneath her ribs. No one here knew the girl she used to be. And that's exactly how she wanted it. Until now. At the corner of 5th and Madison, she stopped. Checked her watch. Ivy would be preparing for the announcement now. Emma could picture it. The lawyers in their dark suits, the estate papers neatly stacked on mahogany desks inside Evans Manor. Ivy in her white silk dress, always white, always perfect, stepping into her role as heir to the Evans legacy. Their father sitting beside her, silent, always silent. She could see it all, every lie, every theft, every betrayal, and yet Emma didn't turn back. She moved, block after block. Every step felt rehearsed, not because she wanted to be there, because she'd waited too long not to be. At the edge of the financial district, her pace slowed. There it was, the estate. Set back behind its wrought iron gates, the old Evans mansion still stood pristine as ever, carved from stone that reflected the sunlight like it was immune to time. But Emma wasn't looking at the walls. She was looking at the past, her prison. And for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't standing on the outside looking back. She was here by choice. Emma slipped her hands into her pockets, ignoring the stiffness in her shoulders. She forced herself to study the house as if it were just another asset, another investment. Another company to be acquired, stripped, rebuilt. But her heart wasn't fooled. 15 years. And the house hadn't changed. But she had. She was no longer the girl who begged to be let back in. Now she was the woman who decided when to knock. She watched the driveway, saw the staff vehicles, the town cars, the security guard who patrolled the perimeter like nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. Because Emma Evans had come home, not to reclaim what was stolen, to destroy it. Her reflection caught in the gate's black metal. Stronger. Colder. She remembered her mother's voice. Don't become like him. She wasn't sure whether she'd kept that promise. But today, that didn't matter. Today wasn't about promises. It was about endings. The security guard approached, cautious. Can I help you, miss? Miss. The corner of Emma's mouth twitched. She considered giving him her name, letting him feel the weight of it. But no. Let them see her when she stepped inside. Let them feel it. Let them remember. Instead, she shook her head. No, and walked away. Not because she was afraid. Because she knew they'd see her soon enough. From the crest of the hill, she turned back one last time. The Evans estate stood still, sunlight glinting off its windows like knives. Emma spoke aloud, then voice low, steady. I'm not here to take it back. She let the words hang in the air like smoke. I'm here to finish it. And when she walked away, she didn't look back. The house wasn't hers, not anymore. But the ending, that belonged to her. The doors slammed shut behind her. Silence settled over the grand hall like dust. Ivy stood frozen behind the podium, every inch of her perfect composure unraveling by the second. The press, the lawyers, the carefully curated guests, all of them watched her now, not with admiration, but with doubt. Emma's words hung heavy in the air. Then Ivy broke. Get out! She snapped, voice cracking against the microphone, panic seeping through her bravado. All of you! This isn't real! No one moved, because it wasn't over. The doors creaked open, and Emma walked back in. She didn't rush. She didn't shout. She carried nothing but a small silver audio recorder in her hand, the kind journalists used, the kind no one noticed until it was too late. Emma's heels clicked against the marble like a metronome counting down. Ivy's breath hitched. Richard Evans, still seated near the fireplace, watched his eldest daughter approach with the same blank, expressionless stare he'd worn the night he locked her out. But Emma saw something different now. Not indifference. Fear. She stopped in the center of the room, held up the recorder. Pressed play! Her mother's voice filled the room. Emma, if you're hearing this, it means I've failed. Every head turned. The air shifted. And then Andrea Evans's voice continued. Raw, tired, a ghost dragged from the grave. I didn't want to sign the papers. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ivy swayed on her feet. He said I had no choice. Emma didn't look at anyone. She just let her mother speak. I thought giving up the company would protect you, Emma. But now I know he planned this. All of it. Her voice cracked. Richard Evans' breathing changed. Emma heard it. Heard the shallow, uneven rhythm of a man cornered. I tried to warn you. I tried to tell you, but he watches everything. Emma glanced sideways. Richard didn't blink. Her mother's voice softened. The final words, I'm sorry. The recording ended. The silence was a scream. Then Ivy stumbled back from the podium. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Her gaze darted wildly across the room, desperate for someone to speak, someone to explain. But no one moved. No one defended her, not even her father. Emma looked at Ivy. This wasn't your idea, was it? Ivy shook her head frantically, but the lie died before it reached her lips. Emma took a step closer. And yet you stood there wearing white, smiling like none of it mattered. Her voice was ice. I thought maybe you were just a pawn. A pause. But pawns don't smile when the king kills the queen. Ivy collapsed onto the nearest chair, breathing, ragged eyes glassy, broken. Emma let her sit there. Then slowly she turned to her father. Richard Evans remained seated, but his knuckles were white where they gripped the chair's arms. Nothing to say, Emma asked softly. Richard's jaw twitched. I didn't kill her? Emma tilted her head. But you didn't stop it. A tremor ran through his body. Emma walked closer. Each step deliberate. Each word colder. You poisoned her. Richard flinched. Emma smiled faintly. You didn't use cyanide. Nothing messy. You weren't sloppy like that. No. You let her drink the tea you made day after day, and you let her heart fail, slowly. Her voice sharpened. Convenient, wasn't it, heart failure? Richard's breathing grew shallow. Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. I wonder if you heard her when she fell. He tried to stand. Failed. His chest convulsed. A ripple of panic flashed through the lawyers. But no one dared approach. Because no one knew whose side they were supposed to be on anymore. Emma stood over her father now, looking down. For once, I'm not here to press charges. Her voice was soft, almost gentle. I'm not here to sue you. Richard gasped, a dry, strangled sound. Emma leaned closer. I'm here to tell you something. She paused. Let him hear the silence. Let him feel the weight of it. I survived. His eyes widened. Emma smiled, cold, serene. I survived you. He reached out a desperate, trembling hand. Emma didn't take it. She stepped back. Richard Evans collapsed. Doctors in the crowd rushed forward, but Emma was already walking away. Behind her, she heard the chaos erupt. The barked orders, the shouted demands. Call an ambulance. Get him on his back. But Emma kept walking. Past Ivy, still curled in her chair like a child. Past the reporters, too stunned to film. Past the guests, frozen in horror. She reached the front door. Paused. Turned. Her voice carried calm and even through the grand hall. You both spent 15 years pretending I was dead. She looked back, gaze sweeping the room. I hope you enjoy learning how that feels. And then Emma Evans walked out. No one followed. The house was quiet now. Not peaceful. Empty. The grand hall that once echoed with power had fallen silent like the walls themselves recoiled from the chaos that unfolded hours earlier. Upstairs behind a closed door, Ivy cried. Not the graceful sobs of a woman betrayed. the raw, jagged sounds of a person realizing too late that the enemy was never outside the walls. It had always been inside, sitting across the dinner table, sharing her last name. Emma stood in the hallway. She didn't move. She didn't knock. She listened, and she let Ivy cry. She could picture her sister without opening the door. The perfect white dress wrinkled, the diamond necklace discarded on the floor, mascara streaked down cheeks that once carried the Evans name like a crown. Emma felt nothing. Not satisfaction. Not pity. Nothing. Because Ivy's tears weren't Emma's victory. They were collateral. Footsteps echoed behind her. Emma turned. Marshall stood there, her lawyer, his face pale. They stabilized him. Emma said nothing. He's at Memorial General. Critical. Her father. Richard Evans. Alive. Barely. Marshall hesitated, unsure how to read her. Do you want to go? Emma looked past him, out the window, to where the rain had started to fall again, soft, this time steady, washing the night clean. I'll handle the paperwork, she said. Emma. She turned away and walked. The hospital sat on the edge of the city, glass and steel and sterile light. Somewhere inside, machines kept her father breathing. Emma stood across the street. She didn't cross. From here, she could see the windows of the cardiac unit glowing pale against the night. She imagined him in there, alone, connected to wires and monitors, trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed him. She should have felt something. Pity, rage, closure. But all she felt was tired. Betrayal makes you believe power is protection, that if you build enough walls, no one can hurt you. But walls don't protect. They imprison. Her mother had known that, and now standing under the streetlight, rain slicking her black suit, Emma wondered if maybe she was just another prisoner, another Evans locked inside her own name. A pair of paramedics rushed past her toward the emergency entrance. She didn't move, didn't follow, didn't even look up when Marshall found her minutes later. You should go in. Emma shook her head. Why not? She answered without hesitation. Because he doesn't get to die while I'm watching. Marshall said nothing. He understood. Emma didn't need closure. She needed distance. She stepped back from the curb, back into the shadows, and as the rain softened into mist, she whispered to herself, betrayal creates monsters. The words hurt. But she forced herself to say them, to believe them. She looked back at the hospital one last time, her reflection caught in the glass, and she finished the thought aloud, but I don't want to be one anymore. She left, not because there was nowhere left to go, but because there was. And for the first time in 15 years, it wasn't back to them. The house hadn't changed. 15 years gone, and still it stood exactly as she remembered. Small, quiet, unremarkable. A house built to be overlooked. A place her mother chose after walking away from the Evans estate. After realizing freedom didn't require walls of stone. Emma stood in the driveway longer than she should have. She could have turned back. She almost did. But something deeper than pride held her in place. She pushed open the gate. Gravel crunched beneath her heels. Her mother's roses had long since withered. Ivy choked the fence now. Emma reached out, ran her fingers over the dead thorns, let them bite her skin. The door was unlocked. Her mother never locked doors. Emma stepped inside. The air smelled the same. Lavender, cedarwood, old pages. Silence pressed in around her, thick and heavy. Not oppressive. Not this time. This was a silence her mother had chosen. Not the silence Emma had been forced into. She moved through the narrow hallway, her fingers brushing the faded photographs lining the walls. Images of her childhood. Summers. Winters. Her mother's smile in every frame. The smile that had never asked for anything but love in return. She stepped into the living room. Everything was where it should be. The patchwork quilt draped over the couch. The brass lamp by the armchair. The bookshelf overstuffed, leaning precariously as always. Emma had forgotten how small this place was. How safe it used to feel. She didn't sit. She couldn't. Instead, her eyes locked onto the far wall, the old desk. Mahogany. Scarred. Its surface worn smooth by years of letters of journals of hands that never stopped moving even when the heart was breaking. Her mother's desk. Emma crossed the room. She dropped to her knees and reached under. Her fingers found it instantly. The lockbox. She pulled it free, brushing aside layers of dust, and set it gently atop the desk. Combination lock. Her mother's birthday. Emma didn't hesitate. She spun the dial. 07-1262. The latch clicked. The box creaked open. Inside, everything was as her mother had left it. The deed to this house. A small photograph of Emma as a child missing 2 front teeth, laughing, and at the bottom a folded envelope. Thick. Yellowed. Emma's name written across the front in her mother's handwriting. She stared at it. For too long. Then slowly she reached in. Her fingers trembled. She unfolded the letter. And read, My Emma, if you're reading this, then I failed you. God knows I tried to shield you from him. From them. But fear makes us weak. And I was so afraid of losing you that I lost myself first. I signed the papers. I thought it was the only way to protect you. But I was wrong. I've been wrong about so many things. Except you. You were always stronger than you believed. I see it in your eyes. You carry my fire. And I'm so sorry for the weight I've placed on your shoulders. Emma's tears blurred the ink. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, forcing herself to keep reading. There will come a day when you're standing alone. When you feel hollow. When their voices tell you that you're nothing. Listen to me. You are not what they said. You are not what they did. You are not broken. And you do not owe them your pain. Emma's breath hitched. Her vision swam. So here's what I ask of you. Not to forgive them, but to forgive yourself. Forgiveness isn't about them, Emma. It's about you. It's the key that opens your own cage. I hope one day you find that key. I hope one day you'll set yourself free. I love you. Always. Mom. Emma didn't realize she was sobbing until her knees gave out. She crumpled to the floor, the letter clutched to her chest, her entire body racked with soundless tears. Not grief, not rage, just release. 15 years? 15 years carrying the wrong weight? Blaming herself for surviving, for being left behind, for being unworthy of love. And now her mother's words wrapped around her like arms she hadn't felt in half a lifetime. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about you. She didn't know how long she lay there. Minutes. Hours. Time didn't matter anymore. Only the sound of her mother's voice in her head. Only the ache in her ribs as she tried to remember how to breathe. And then slowly Emma sat up. She unfolded the letter again. Read the last line. I hope one day you'll set yourself free. Emma whispered, a loud voice cracking like a child's. I don't know how. And maybe that was okay. Because admitting that was the first step. She pressed the letter to her lips, closed her eyes, and for the first time in 15 years let herself believe she wasn't alone. Not really. Her mother had never left her. Not here. Not in this house. Not in her. Emma sat in the silence until it felt like peace. Not absence. Peace. And somewhere deep inside something that had been broken, shifted. Not healed, but maybe ready to try. She folded the letter carefully, returned it to the envelope, and whispered, I'll try, Mom. The words didn't echo. They settled. Soft. True. And Emma Evans, for the first time in her life, allowed herself to cry without shame. Not as a victim. Not as a survivor. But as a daughter. She found Emma at dawn. Not at the mansion. Not at the office. Not in courtrooms or hotel lobbies where deals were made in silence. She found her here. At their mother's house. The small one. The forgotten one. Ivy hesitated at the gate, standing there like a child on the wrong doorstep, hair disheveled, makeup, smeared white silk dress ruined from a night spent running from cameras that wouldn't stop chasing her. The queen stripped of her crown. She didn't belong here, and she knew it, but she pushed open the gate anyway. Gravel crunched under her expensive heels. Emma was sitting on the porch, coffee in hand, quiet, calm. Her eyes didn't flicker when Ivy appeared. She'd been expecting her. Ivy stopped at the bottom step. Her voice cracked before the words could find structure. They won't stop. Emma said nothing. Reporters, stockholders, board members, everyone. Still nothing. Ivy's voice sharpened, desperate. You did this. Emma met her eyes for the first time. I told the truth. Ivy faltered. Her voice dropped. It doesn't matter what's true anymore. She looked broken when she said it. Emma held her gaze steady. That's the first honest thing you've said in years. Silence stretched. Then Ivy sank down onto the steps, her body folding inwards. Not for performance, not for sympathy, because she didn't have the strength to stand anymore. Emma watched her. She waited, and eventually Ivy broke. I don't know what to do. The admission cost her. Emma could hear it, taste it, the bitter aftertaste of surrender. Ivy, Emma said softly. Not cruel, not kind, just true. You spent your whole life running from being second. Ivy flinched. But no one ever told you the truth. What truth? Ivy whispered. Emma stood, walked past her, into the house. Ivy sat there, alone. For a moment, she thought that was it, that Emma had left her sitting there on that porch forever. Then footsteps. Emma returned. A folder in hand. She set it down beside Ivy. Calm, precise. Ivy blinked at it like she didn't recognize the object. What is that? Emma's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. Your way out. Ivy shook her head confused. Hope felt too dangerous. Emma clarified. Operational blueprints, financial breakdowns, contract assessments, everything you need to run what's left of Evans Holdings. Ivy's breath caught. I can't. Emma's voice didn't soften. Then you'll drown. Tears welled in Ivy's eyes. Why are you giving me this? Emma paused. The air shifted. Her answer came colder than Ivy expected. I'm not. Ivy's brow furrowed. Emma looked at her, direct, unyielding. I'm giving you a choice. She stepped back, because she was done. Her work here was finished. Ivy grabbed the folder with trembling hands. Emma's voice followed her like a verdict. You don't need me to save you. She turned. Her final words drifted over her shoulder. I'm giving you the chance to save yourself. And then Emma Evans walked away, leaving Ivy alone with her decision. The stack of documents sat on the desk like a weight she'd carried for far too long. Legal drafts, litigation files, inheritance challenge petitions, evidence records. Every paper in that stack was a door to vengeance, to justice, to revenge, to punishment. She ran her fingers over the first page, her father's name, her sister's, signatures that once ruled her life. Emma Evans closed her eyes, and she remembered her mother's words. Forgiveness isn't about them, Emma. It's about you. She opened her eyes again, and without hesitation, she gathered every single page into her arms. She crossed the room and dropped them into the fireplace. The flames caught instantly. They didn't struggle. Paper never did. It burned too easily. She stood there watching as the life she could have chosen, the war she could have fought, turned black and ash before her. The letters twisted. The ink melted. The contracts dissolved. No court would hear her case now. No judge would weigh her pain. No headline would write her revenge. And for the first time in her life, Emma felt light. Not weightless. Just unburdened. She whispered to the flame's voice, low, steady. I'm not letting you define me anymore. The last of the papers collapsed. The fire died. And the past with it. She turned away from the ashes. She didn't need to see them cool. The fight was over. Not because she'd won, but because she'd chosen to stop fighting. Her footsteps echoed through the empty house. Her mother's house. Her house now. But she didn't plan on staying. Emma stepped outside. Morning was breaking over the city skyline, pale and quiet. The streets were empty. She liked it that way. Her car waited at the curb. Not the Bentley, not the chauffeur. Just her. Her own hands on the wheel. For once, she slid behind the wheel, shut the door softly, and let the silence settle. No phone calls. No lawyers. No press. Just the hum of the engine and the sound of her own breathing. Emma looked at herself in the rearview mirror. Her reflection looked back. Not the CEO. Not the heir. Not the exile. Just a woman. Tired, but free. Her voice broke the silence, soft and true. Forgiveness isn't because they deserve it. She paused, watched her own eyes harden. It's because I do. She turned the key. The engine roared. Emma Evans drove. Not toward the mansion. Not toward the courthouse. Not toward anyone who knew her name. She drove away from the city. From the legacy. From the war. Toward something she didn't have a name for. Not yet, but she'd find it. Somewhere beyond the horizon. Somewhere past the lies. Somewhere no one would ever call her a mistake again. She didn't need their permission to be free. She just needed the road. And now finally she had it. Emma Evans didn't look back. Not once. The hospital smelled like every hospital. Bleach and hopelessness. Emma hated that smell. She walked the sterile hallway like a ghost, her heels silent against the polished floor. No one stopped her. Nurses avoided her eyes. Doctors shifted out of her path. They knew who she was. They knew who she was here to see. Room 409. She stood in front of the door for a long time. Long enough to reconsider. Long enough to remind herself that she owed him nothing. And yet, she opened the door. The machines beeped softly in the dark. Richard Evans lay in the bed. Pale, shrunken, small. Her father had once filled every room he entered. With his voice. With his presence. With the cold, suffocating weight of control. Now he was wires and bone. His breathing came shallow, uneven. His eyes fluttered open. He saw her. For a moment, confusion flickered, then recognition. She watched it happen. His lips parted dry and cracked, but no sound came. Emma said nothing. She stepped closer. Each step felt heavier than the last. She stopped at the foot of the bed, close enough to hear him struggle to breathe, close enough for him to see the person she'd become. His mouth worked around her name. Emma. A rasp, barely audible. She stared at him, expressionless. I wasn't sure you'd come. His voice shook like broken glass. Emma didn't reply. Richard coughed a dry, rattling sound that scraped her nerves but didn't pierce her walls. I thought, maybe you'd forgive me. Silence. She let it stretch until it hurt. Then quietly, with no hatred, no warmth, just truth, she answered. You're not my father. His eyes widened. Not anymore. A pause. You stopped being that the day Mom died. He tried to reach for her. His hand shook so violently it barely left the sheet. Emma stepped back and watched his hand fall. I didn't come here to forgive you. Her voice didn't waver. I didn't come here to hate you either. She saw it in his eyes then. The understanding. The surrender. I came to say goodbye. Richard's lips trembled. I'm sorry. Emma shook her head, slow and deliberate. I don't care. The machines beeped steadily. A heartbeat she no longer recognized. I survived you. Tears welled in his eyes. She didn't look away. I survived her death. A pause. I survived losing everything. Her voice hardened. But I didn't survive to save you. A single tear slid down his cheek. Emma let it fall. She didn't wipe it, didn't offer comfort, didn't offer closure, because some wounds don't close. And not every ending needs forgiveness. Emma took one step back, then another. His breathing grew more labored. His mouth moved, forming words she no longer cared to hear. At the door, she paused. She looked back, one last time. He looked small, human, not the monster she'd spent her life hating, just a man, dying. She spoke softly, flat. You're free to die now. And then she left. She didn't look back. Not once. Because Richard Evans had died for her a long time ago. All that was left was paperwork. She remembered the rain that night. Not the soft kind. The violent kind. The kind that clawed at the windows like something alive. Something trying to get in or trying to pull someone out. 15. That's how old she'd been. And 15 was far too young to understand betrayal, but old enough to recognize silence. Dinner had been quiet. Quieter than usual. Her mother's voice, once the only warmth in that cold house, had been thin that night. Thin and brittle, like a thread stretched too tight. Every time she spoke, Emma flinched, half expecting the words to snap. Eat 'em. That had been the last thing Andrea Evans said to her. Emma remembered the sound of the silverware scraping across porcelain. She'd picked at the vegetables on her plate, too nauseous to swallow. Her mother barely touched her food at all. Across the table, Richard sat unmoved. A ghost in a three-piece suit. Then it happened. Quietly. Too quietly. Her mother's fork clattered to the floor. Emma looked up. She saw her mother's hand trembling. A small tremor like a leaf caught in wind. Mom. Andrea Evans's eyes flickered, then glazed. Then her body folded slow and sickening like a marionette whose strings had been cut. She collapsed onto the floor. Emma screamed. Mom. Her chair's scraped back legs catching on the marble floor, toppling over as she ran to her. Andrea's body convulsed once, then twice. Emma dropped beside her. Mom, please, please. She didn't know where to touch. She didn't know how to help. She only knew she couldn't lose her. Not like this. Dad. Emma looked up, choking on sobs. And that was when the memory shifted from nightmare to something worse. Richard stood there, motionless, watching. His face didn't change. His mouth didn't move. He stood over them both, and did nothing. Emma screamed at him. Do something. Nothing. Andrea gasped. A wet, ragged sound. Emma turned back, cradling her mother's head in her lap. Her mother's eyes flicked toward her. Just once. A flicker of recognition. A flicker of regret. Then, gone. No, 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 please. She rocked back and forth. She begged. She screamed. The storm outside howled louder. Rain lashed against the windows. Thunder cracked like bones snapping. But the house stayed silent. Except for Emma. Her scream tore itself from her throat, raw and endless. She didn't remember stopping. She only remembered the silence after. Her mother's body lay still in her arms. Her warmth fading. Her scent disappearing. Her voice gone. The only sound was the rain. And her father's breathing. Calm. Steady. Measured. Until finally Emma looked up. Eyes swollen. Voice shattered. Why? Richard Evans said nothing. He just turned and walked away, leaving Emma kneeling on the marble floor, holding a corpse. She sat there long after the rain stopped. She never remembered who called the ambulance. Maybe it was one of the maids. Maybe no one did. Because by the time they dragged Andrea Evans's body from that house, she wasn't a person anymore. She was a problem solved. Emma's fists clenched. Even now, even years later, she remembered the coldness of her mother's skin. She remembered the weight of her head against her lap. She remembered the blood under her fingernails where she'd clawed at the floor, begging God or anyone to take her instead. And no one came. No one saved her. Not from the storm outside. Not from the storm inside. And when they buried her mother 3 days later, Richard Evans never once touched the casket. Emma had watched him, stone-faced, distant, inhuman. And that was the day she understood. Her mother hadn't died from illness. She'd died from silence. And silence could kill. Emma dragged herself back from the memory, her body trembling, her throat raw. The rain outside the hospital window echoed the rain from that night. But she was no longer 15, and she was no longer begging. Now she was remembering. And that perhaps was even crueler. The letter wasn't long. Emma kept it that way for a reason. Her words were precise, measured not because she didn't have more to say, but because saying too much would weaken what mattered. She signed her name at the bottom. No love. No regret. Just truth. She folded the letter once, then twice. Slipped it into the unmarked envelope. No return address. No signature. She didn't need to explain herself anymore. She left the envelope at the front desk of Ivy's penthouse without waiting to be seen. Let her find it. Let her read it alone. That was how it had to be. Emma walked away from the glass tower, from the life her sister had built on borrowed power from the war neither of them had ever truly won. Because it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about ending. Somewhere far above her, Ivy would find the envelope, and inside she'd find the words Emma could never say aloud. "You're not my enemy anymore." Emma hadn't wanted Ivy's forgiveness, and she hadn't wanted Ivy's pain. What she wanted, what she needed, was for both of them to stop bleeding from wounds neither of them knew how to close. Not sisters. Not rivals. Just survivors. When Ivy read the letter, she cried. Not the desperate sobs of that night when the empire collapsed around her, but the quiet kind. The kind that hurt deeper. Because for the first time in her life, Ivy Evans understood family wasn't about inheritance, or bloodlines, or control. It was about choice, and she had never chosen Emma. Not until now. When Ivy's tears fell onto the paper, they blurred the last line. "I hope someday you'll stop trying to outrun the person you are." But Ivy read it anyway, and for once she didn't resent it. Because it wasn't judgment, it was mercy. Emma never saw the tears. She never needed to. Her work was done. She drove to the house. Not the mansion. Not the penthouse. Her mother's house. Her house now. But it didn't feel like possession. It felt like memory. Emma crossed the threshold without looking back. She went straight to the study. She opened the small, worn lockbox beneath the desk. Inside, the old letters waited. Her mother's handwriting, her childhood drawings, and now, the last envelope. She added it carefully. No ceremony, no tears, just finality. She closed the lid, and she turned the key, not to hide the past, but to honor it. The lock clicked into place, and the sound wasn't a prison. It was a release. Emma sat back, breathed. She wasn't erasing what had been done. She wasn't pretending it hadn't hurt. She was choosing to stop carrying it. The feud was over, not because someone surrendered, because someone chose to stop fighting. She stood up. The room felt lighter. She left the lockbox where it belonged. Closed. Safe. Finished. And when she walked outside into the pale morning light, Emma Evans felt something she hadn't in 15 years. Empty. But for the first time, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like peace. The lake didn't care who she was. It lay still silent, a sheet of dark glass stretched out before her, unbroken, unbothered. Emma stood at its edge as the morning settled into pale gray. No wind, no birds, nothing. She liked that. Silence felt honest here. Not like the silence of the Evans house, thick and suffocating. Not like the silence in her father's hospital room. This silence didn't weigh on her. It freed her. Her fingers tightened around the object in her palm. Cold. Heavy. Her father's ring. The family crest glinted faintly in the soft light, and engraved twisted vines surrounding it like thorns. She'd taken it from his bedside. Not as a trophy, not as a reminder, but for this. She looked down at it now. A simple band, a piece of gold that carried generations of rot. She remembered the first time she'd seen it. She'd been 7. Her father had knelt beside her in the garden, slipping it from his own finger to let her hold it for just a second. "You'll wear it someday," he'd told her. Back then she'd believed him. She didn't understand yet that monsters made promises too. Emma closed her fist around the ring, let herself feel its shape, its weight, its lie. And then she whispered, soft, steady, "I don't carry your name." Her voice cracked. "I never did." She opened her hand, stared at the ring resting in her palm like an accusation. The lake waited. No judgment. No ceremony. Just an ending. Her mother's voice echoed inside her skull. "Forgiveness isn't about them, Emma. It's about you." Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I'm not an Evans." Her words tasted like steel. "I'm me." She drew her arm back and threw. The ring caught the pale sunlight for a heartbeat. A glint of gold spinning through the air. Then, silence. The surface of the water broke, swallowed, closed, gone. Emma stood still, watching the ripples fade. No music played. No wind answered. Just silence, and the distant beat of her own heart. She thought she'd feel triumphant. She didn't. She thought she'd feel whole. She didn't. She felt empty. But the kind of empty that felt like a beginning, not an end. She sat down. Right there at the edge of the lake, knees pulled to her chest, forehead resting against her arms. And for the first time, she allowed herself to stop. To breathe. To be nothing. To belong to no one. The past wasn't chasing her anymore. The future wasn't demanding anything yet. She could just be. And that was enough. For now. Because she wasn't her father's daughter. She wasn't her sister's rival. She wasn't a legacy. She wasn't a name. She was Emma. Just Emma. And finally, that was all she wanted to be. When the sun broke through the clouds an hour later, Emma Evans was still sitting there. But for the first time in her life, the weight in her chest was gone. The office looked smaller without him. Ivy stood in the doorway for a long time. Just stood there. She had never seen this space empty before. Her father's chair was gone, his desk stripped bare. The heavy portraits of past Evans patriarchs removed from the walls, leaving behind faint rectangular ghosts on the paint. The silence inside wasn't suffocating like she expected. It was humbling. She stepped inside. Each footstep felt heavier than it should have. Ivy looked around. No board of directors waiting. No press conferences scheduled. No father to shield her or control her. Just her and the mess. Stacks of old files. Dust. A wastebasket overflowing. A stain from coffee spilled weeks ago still sticky in the corner. Ivy pulled her hair back into a loose knot. And without thinking, without command, without instruction, she moved. She crossed the office, found the closet, retrieved the cleaning supplies. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't deliberate. It was necessary. The first act of control she'd taken in years. She dropped to her knees and began scrubbing the coffee stain. The rag turned brown quickly. She didn't care. She kept wiping. The floor squeaked faintly beneath her hands. Her breathing slowed. Her body hurt. But she didn't stop. Not until the stain was gone. Then she sat back, exhausted, sweating, and looked around the office. Her office. For the first time, Ivy Evans saw the space not as something she inherited, but something she owned. And maybe, just maybe, something she could deserve. She cleaned the whole place, floor to ceiling. She carried out the trash herself. She wiped the dust from the windows. She didn't hire a crew. She didn't ask for help. She did it alone. And when she finished, she stood in the center of the gleaming, empty office, stripped of her father's legacy, stripped of everything she once thought made her important. And she smiled. A small, quiet smile. Not of pride. Not of victory. Of relief. She wasn't pretending anymore. Ivy Evans had finally begun. Across the city, Emma read the news. It wasn't front-page material. A minor article buried in the business section. New leadership direction announced at Evans Holdings. She skimmed the article. No mention of her father. No mention of herself. Just Ivy. Taking the helm. Starting over. Emma finished the article. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled. A real smile. Soft. Brief. True. Not because she won, but because Ivy might have. And maybe that was enough. Emma folded the paper. Set it aside. She didn't need to know the details. She didn't need to watch her sister's next chapter. She was done writing theirs. Her story belonged elsewhere now. Outside the towers. Beyond the name. Somewhere she could finally call her own. Emma Evans leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and let the past go. The earth was softer than she expected. Emma knelt beside the freshly turned soil, her hands' bare fingers pressing into the cool, damp earth. The sun was just beginning to settle over the hills, casting long golden beams across her small patch of land. No walls, no gates, no estate. Just sky, just quiet, just her. She dug carefully, clearing space for the new roots. Dahlias. She didn't know why she chose them. Maybe because her mother used to plant them. Maybe because they didn't ask for much to bloom. Maybe because they just felt right. She pressed the bulbs gently into the ground. Not rushed, not methodical, just present. Her nails broke. Dirt filled the lines of her skin. She didn't care. She kept planting. Above her, the wind moved softly through the trees. No horns, no city noise, just the rustle of leaves and the quiet pulse of her own breathing. For the first time, Emma Evans wasn't chasing anything. Not revenge, not justice, not ghosts. She was just here, living. She sat back on her heels and looked over the small, imperfect rows. They weren't straight. They weren't clean. They were hers. She wiped sweat from her brow and whispered softly to no one but herself. No one tells you this. She let the words hang in the warm, open air. No one tells you that ending a war is its own kind of victory. Her voice cracked. She didn't wipe her tears. She let them fall soft as rain, because they weren't grief. They weren't regret. They were release. She pressed her hands into the dirt again, grounding herself. She didn't need a boardroom. She didn't need a signature. She didn't need a last name. She just needed this. A patch of earth. A second chance. A morning she could wake into without fear. Her garden would grow slowly, imperfectly, but it would grow. So would she. Emma stood up her back, aching, her hands filthy, and smiled. The small, quiet kind. Not for anyone else. For herself. She turned back toward the small house behind her. Her house. No history attached. No legacy. Just a place to belong. She walked toward it, her footsteps soft against the grass. No one waited inside. No one needed to. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was healing. And that was enough. The morning didn't announce itself. It just arrived. Soft light crept over the hills, pale and golden, spilling across the dewy grass outside the small house. The world wasn't waiting for her. It didn't know she'd changed. It didn't care. And that, Emma thought, was its own mercy. She stood at the edge of the porch, barefoot, still wearing the old cotton shirt she'd slept in. The morning was cool against her skin, not sharp, not uncomfortable, just real. For the first time in her life, she felt the air without armor. Her fingers rested loosely against the railing. No coffee in her hand. No phone buzzing at her side. No schedule waiting to devour her, just silence. And sunrise. She watched the light stretch across her small patch of land. The garden she'd planted the day before barely broke the surface rows of dirt, still rough, uncertain. Like her. But it was there, and it would grow. She took a slow breath. She didn't think of Ivy. She didn't think of her father. She didn't think of Evan's holdings or legacy or betrayal or names spoken like weapons. She thought of her mother, Andrea Evans, gone for 15 years. Present every day since. Emma closed her eyes, felt the sunlight against her face, and whispered not with sadness, not with regret, but with something closer to grace. "Mom, I'm home." Her voice cracked on the last word. She let it. She didn't need to be strong anymore. Not here. Not now. She opened her eyes, looked at the horizon. The sunlight caught her hair streaked gold against her skin, framed her like the woman she'd become. Not someone's daughter, not someone's mistake, not someone's heir. Just Emma. And she smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't triumphant. It was simple, soft, real. Behind her inside the house, nothing stirred. She didn't need anyone to witness this. This moment wasn't for them. It was for her. And maybe, just maybe, for her mother. She breathed again, easier this time. And the weight that had clung to her shoulders, wrapped around her lungs, woven itself into her spine for 15 years, was gone. Not ripped away. Released. Because Emma Evans hadn't been running. She hadn't been fighting. She'd just been searching. And finally she'd found it. A place that didn't need to remember who she was. A life that didn't ask her to explain. Freedom. Not victory. Not revenge. Freedom. She stepped down from the porch. The grass was cool under her feet. She walked forward slowly past the edge of the house into the light. The camera would hold on her there, letting the moment settle, letting the audience breathe with her. Then the music would rise. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, calm, healing. And as the sun rose fully behind her, casting her silhouette against the endless morning sky, Emma whispered one final time, her voice so soft the world might miss it. "I'm home." Fade to black. End.